So, two announcements before we start. First, just to remind you that tomorrow at 6 o'clock, Ressa Lang, which is on 13th Street, on the uptown side of the street, Christava's talking on Motherhood Today, which sounds like an intriguing topic. And then something I didn't know about, but I don't even know what association this is, but this weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, at the Fordham University Manhattan campus, there is really a fabulous Saucer conference that has just about anyone, Sonia Crook, Penny Deutscher, Ronald Aronson, Dennis Collier. I mean, really a fantastic lineup of speakers. If you want to see the program, have a look at halftime. That's the whole program. But I really urge you, I mean, this is really, looks like a really major event. So tomorrow, Thursday.
My jacket in here, I'm sorry.
I'm sure it's here somewhere. Maybe.
Sorry.
The dialectic keeps moving. Okay. So, yeah, there's the announcement for the Christava. Okay, any mechanical questions, everyone? Okay, you gave me a very, very, very bad week. I felt that if something was going wrong, then I was doing something wrong. So I paid dearly and wrote a whole new lecture on force and understanding, which is now you have to suffer. So everyone will all suffer together. But I assume that if something goes wrong, it's because, this is something to think about in teaching, when the class goes wrong, it's usually because there's an enthymeme somewhere, which is to say there's an argument with missing steps. And what I've tried to do is find out what the missing steps were and put them in. So what I'm trying to do today is get there in a way that is compelling and do all the things that various people ask me to do after the class and say, oh, we'll do this, do that. So I thought I would. And I want to reframe the question of force and understanding. And I hope this week you'll be ready to ask me questions if I go astray. But I want to reframe it from a hint that Adam Geese gave me last time in class. So, let me catch my breath. Two steps to really keep as our frame. And here's the first two steps of the frame. First, that my reading of Hegel's phenomenological method, in which we can phenomenologically look on, we can look on because consciousness examines itself. And consciousness examines itself because every form of consciousness poses its own conception of truth, what Hegel calls the in itself, and a corresponding conception of knowing, what cognizing that kind of in itself must be like. In itself, this, the form of knowing, sense certainty. And I suggested that this method, this way in which there's an internal relationship between an in itself and a for consciousness, truth, certainty, is in fact nothing but a generalization of Kant's Copernican term, in which self-consciousness relates to objects by projecting upon the world a concept of an object in general. So my operating assumption all along is that we Kantians have that idea. That is, we face the world by projecting upon it some concept of an object in general, and the phenomenological method simply assumes that for every possible form of consciousness. Second framing thought. The entire chapter on consciousness, that is sense certainty, perception, and force and understanding, those three forms of consciousness, all of which are called consciousness by Hegel. What makes them all consciousness is that they are pre-Kantian and hence pre-Copernican in their assumptions about how they relate to the world, and in each of those three forms assume there is an in itself the this, the object of perception, the one and the many, and force, that is the ultimate matter of fact which makes knowledge true. Now, to say that these are pre-Kantian or pre-Copernican makes it sound as if they're making a dumb mistake, but they're not. So I want to step one step back and say what's important about these forms of consciousness. What they're assuming is in fact deeply intuitive. Namely, what they're assuming is that the fundamental structure of knowing involves us in matching our representations to the world. So the world is the measure of our knowing. And hence the world is the measure of truth. As oppositely now, so the knowing world, and in the knowing world relationship, world determines knowing. So the direction is from the world to knowing. As oppositely, we suppose, and this is why it's deep, in action, we assume that we determine or make the world. That is, we make the world correspond to our desires or needs or plans or ends or goals. And that this structure, that the direction of knowing runs from world to mind, while the direction of action runs from mind to world, is the difference between knowing and acting. That in knowing we're trying to get our representations to correspond to the world, while in action we're trying to get the world to correspond to our actions. Right? Which is why, Marx got so upset with Feuerbach. Right? So the overwhelming assumption is how knowing differs from action is in their fundamental direction. That the direction of knowing is that the world determines me, hence that there must be a deep stratum of passivity in the phenomenon of knowing in order for objectivity to be possible. While conversely, the direction of action is that I determine the world, hence a fundamental stance of activity. So that knowing and action are different stances towards the world. As if, right, In knowing, we contemplate the world. That's why it's often thought of contemplation. In action, we make the world. So, now looking at this structure, it may look familiar to you, since, in fact, we often think that this way of this passivity is what gives us the idea that the world determines mind causally, while action determines the world through freedom. And if we look at that structure, it suddenly begins to look like Kant's third antinomy, where every cause has another cause, no cause without a first cause. I'll come back to this structure in a moment. But the thought here is that consciousness is playing out this stance. Consciousness is assuming this structure, which is just the intuitive, traditional, classical structure about the difference between knowing and action. And it makes just one, or rather two further assumptions. First, that I am in the world, and hence I have a world only through my representations of the world. So that it's representation that gives me a world in general. And second, that the fundamental meaning of knowing is that the world determines me, and hence I am passive with respect to the world. Force and understanding in this setup is hence the scientific picture of this structure, and hence the idea that the meaning of consciousness is being given by a certain kind of representation of the world, namely the kind of representation of the world that is assumed above all in modern natural science, but also, for reasons I'll come to in a moment, in Plato. Plato and modern natural science share many similar structures. Okay, those are the two background assumptions governing this setup. An aside. As we're going to see later, the structural view that knowledge in the last instance requires a stance of passivity, and action in the last stance requires one of absolute activity. That structure, or world determining me, me determining world, exactly as is the structure of Kant's third antinomy on causality and freedom, and it is equally the structure of the first two chapters of the Phenomenology. This is the structure of consciousness as a whole, and this is going to be the structure of self-consciousness as a whole. Action determining world. That's where we're going. Now, both views are false. You knew that was coming. And unlike Kant, what Kant does is says both true views must be true. And in order to make both views true, he draws a line between them and calls this phenomena and this noumena. And that's how Kant solves or preserves the ultimate structure of this way of doing things. Hegel is not going to resolve this antinomy by adopting a notion of noumenal freedom. He is going to argue that consciousness cannot sustain its posture of passivity. That's what we're going to read about today. Why consciousness is forced into become the stance of agency. But we're equally going to discover that self-consciousness is going to have to acknowledge absolute dependency or passivity. So, we'll complicate the story here, but roughly we're going to join these, and their joining is going to be reason. So we're going to get a different resolution to this fundamental deep structure, and I'm saying this deep structure is very much the structure of what knowledge means. And if you read analytic philosophy, they assume this structure all the time. This is what analytic philosophy is about, this structure and how the two sides hang together, and it's all variations on the Kantian solution. Or, even worse, just subsuming this side into that side. Just make it all passive, right? Make it passivity all the way down. But, even Sellers, for those of you who know Sellers, this, becomes the manifest image, and this becomes the scientific image. And it just becomes incoherent at that very point. Right? And Sellers kind of knew it. He has a thing called Méditation hegelienne, where he tries to worry about this problem. Okay. That's the end of my aside. That's the structural setup. Here's the third moment, what Adam reminded me I needed to say. The third element of my framing. Hegel supposes that despite the fact that all of consciousness is pre-Copernican, and despite the fact that our method itself is Copernican, that what Hegel is trying to do in the chapter on consciousness is phenomenologically demonstrate the necessity of the Copernican term. That he wants to demonstrate how consciousness cannot sustain its fundamentally passive stance, and it cannot continue to deny its own constitutive role in making objectivity possible, and that it is somehow, and here's the problem that you were all suffering with last week, it is somehow forced, made, pushed to turn upon itself and to take responsibility for its knowing. Now, I put it that way, it's forced to take responsibility for its knowing. I am not saying it's forced to become active, because consciousness has been active almost from the beginning, but it explicitly becomes active already in consciousness, right? It becomes active when it says, I'm responsible for falsity. But it just tries to make that activity non-constitutive of the conditions of objectivity. So the shift is going to be it must acknowledge the constitutive role of its activity. That is, its responsibility, and I'll get to this in a moment, for articulating the relationship between identity and difference, the one and the many. Okay, so this is the kicker. We must demonstrate the necessity of the Copernican turn, and it's interesting that Hegel takes this as his job because it's exactly what Kant did not do and thought could not be done. On the contrary, if you recall, Kant introduced the Copernican turn as already happening, as, to put it in his terms, a conjecture or hypothesis. So he doesn't demonstrate that we have to turn. What he asks is, I'm now quoting from B16 in the introduction, we must therefore make trial. We must therefore attempt, make trial, whether we may not have more success in the tasks of metaphysics if we suppose that our objects must conform to our knowledge. That they must conform to us, not we conform to them. This is an extraordinary thing to say. That the Copernican turn is asking, rather demanding, that knowledge, the world, conform to it. Now, of course, you can see you're already thinking, Kant's looking weirder by the second. Of course, only at the level of form, not the level of content. The form is the concept of an object in general, or the worldhood of the world. That's where we project the contents, the actual empirical contents, come from the world. Nonetheless, that's the thesis. So he says a page earlier in the introduction, when he's actually talking about how he's reading modern science, they learn that reason has insight only into what it produces after a plan of its own. Reason has insight only what it produces after a plan of its own. And that must not allow itself to be kept, as it were, in nature's leading strings. That is actually going to be the conclusion of force and understanding. We get insight only after a plan of our own. Okay, that's the frame. So we have to demonstrate the necessity of making the Copernican turn. But of course, it's slightly question-begging, again, because it's a Copernican methodology that's going to lead us there. Now the puzzle. Are we all right there? Let me just take a breath. That's the setup. Are we all clear about it? Get exhausted thinking about the setup. Is that a reasonable frame of problematicity? Now the question arises. I think this is where I screwed up last week. Probably wondering, where did he screw up? Here's where I screwed up. What kind of failure is occurring in force and understanding? What kind of defeat does this form of consciousness undergo? And why, just to push this thought a bit further, why does this form of failing force it into Copernicus? That's, I think, the micro grain of argumentation that I have not yet got fully perspicuous, but I'm going to try to make it perspicuous now. Or at least it looks perspicuous to me at 3 o'clock this morning when I wrote this. Okay. In sense certainty, the failure occurred, just to remind you, the nature of the failure occurred because consciousness could not achieve the determinacy that its own stipulation, its notion of the in itself, required. So he kept wanting to say this, and this never appeared. So the indeterminate, the determinate, pointing always became indeterminate and indeed the universal. The form of failure in perception is different. And this is kind of interesting all by itself. And we ought to be thinking about how different forms of consciousness fail. And they're going to fail differently. The form of failure in perception occurred not because of lack of determinacy. The determinacy was given by the complex of universals. That's how objects are determinate. It failed because it could not hold together the two components of its concept of an object. The one and the many. That is, it couldn't figure out how the determinacy from the many was the many of a one. Right? So what it couldn't think, sometimes I love philosophy for its atrocious silliness. What it couldn't think is the word of. Why are these properties of the thing? It couldn't hold that together, and they kept falling apart. Now, the most important thing to notice about the one in the chapter on perception is that it is a bare substratum. That is, it was not itself actually a perceptual item, but rather it was a kind of posit or presupposition necessary to hold the many properties together. Why is that important? Well, it's because Hegel's being sneaky. And what he's doing is little by little phenomenologically introducing the idea that in order to have a determinate cognitive awareness of an object or event, there must be some feature of that object or situation, namely its oneness, what makes it a determinate one, that is not itself perceptual or sensible. Right? So just think about you or Locke. They've got lots of stuff going on, right? What they can't do is figure out the notion of one. And they can't figure out the notion of one because the notion of one itself is not another perceptual item. Which, of course, is what you kept saying. There's no idea of substance. There's no idea of the underlying. There's nothing, But the opposite thought should be ticking away. It's going to be Kant's thought that indeed the one is not another perceptual item. and that therefore the necessary condition for the possibility of object awareness is that there be a non-sensible one collecting or holding together the sensible many. In the handout I gave you from Kant, we'll come back to this, if there's any place in Kant where he actually makes the Copernican turn. Yeah. Oh. What else? You have to do what Rossio says to do. If there's any place in the first critique where Kant actually does a Copernican turn, as I'll come to later, it's actually A109. A109 is one of my favorite passages. I wrote half my PhD on it. So those who've done Kant with me already will be bored by the way I keep coming back to this passage. Just the very beginning of A109 is all I want to look at. Appearances are the sole objects which can be given to us immediately. You there? And that in them which relates immediately to an object is called intuition. But these appearances are not things in themselves. They are only representations, which in turn have their object, an object which cannot itself be intuited by us, and which may therefore be named the non-empirical. That is, the transcendental object equals X. Now, what he's thinking about in the transcendental object equals X is Locke's new way of ideas. And Locke's idea is that we have these somethings, these properties, and there must be something underlying them, which is a something I know not what. That's why it's an X. Because it's not another perceptual item. It's a something I know not what, and it's the source of the unity. Now, consciousness, in Force and Understanding, is searching for that transcendental object. It is looking for the X, which will confer upon the appearances a unity. And it is positing that, and it is doing so in order that it can satisfy the dilemma raised by perception, which had the one and the many falling apart. So what Force and Understanding is going to do is say there must really be an underlying something. And therefore there must be a two-tiered account of the concept of an object in general, in which the unity of the object is derived from a non-sensible ground, or what Hegel calls an unconditioned universal. So the whole movement of the chapter on Force and Understanding is an exploration of the various non-ideal candidates for the non-sensible unity of experience. Now you're getting it. I sort of smile. I haven't seen a smile in weeks. Okay. So each of the things that are going to be put on, forces and laws and all this kind of stuff, all that is going to be the transcendental object equals x. It's going to be placeholders for the x, going to be values of that variable. So making Locke's account truly metaphysically two-tiered, as I won't go through the story, it really wasn't Locke. And as Locke was not an empiricist, but a scientific realist. That's another whole course. Okay. Well, now, what I said last week may make a little sense. My first gambit last week, and I'm not going to repeat what I did last week. I'm going to mention it now and then move forward. So you'll just have to stick in because I didn't look back either, stick in the missing bits. But my first argument last week concerned, in moving to the two-tiered model, we posit the notion of force as the underlying source of unity. And we chose force, if you recall, because force, by its very nature, is something that must express itself. That is, the in itself of force, what force is to be for another. That is, to create the appearances. Now, my argument last week was that this move did not really take us past the dilemma that we already saw in the chapter on perception. Let us think of it this way. And now I'm going to do a variation on this, tying it into contemporary views in the philosophy of science. If we ask ourselves, what makes a particular underlying force the force it is, the answer is going to be that it gives rise to exactly these appearances. So that the meaning of the force, which was supposed to be the explainer, is given by what it explained. Right? And there's a whole literature on this. Start with it, the simplest version is in Molière. I recall correctly, where someone says, opium has a secret normative power. Oh, what is that power that opium has? It makes you fall asleep. Well, the question is, what more do we learn about the meaning of power than we fall asleep when we take opium? That is the upshot of the claim that something has a certain power is simply the appearances it gives at the end of the day. So, and now this is, by the way, the standard empiricist, instrumentalist critique of scientific realism and theories of power and force, namely that there's no more content in force or power talk than the regularity of the appearances that it was meant to explain. That is, it's sort of empty. We already know, take some opium, you fall asleep. All right, now we have a causal regularity. Take some opium, fall asleep. Okay. Now the scientific realist says, I know why. Because it has the power. And now you ask, well, what is that power? It makes you fall asleep. Right? So we can't seem to get any extra content out of the postulation of forces or powers or entelechies or whatever other stuff you think is going on there. And even in contemporary philosophy of science, this is a standard critical gesture. The most sustained version of it you can find in Bos van Frossen's writings. But there are versions of it in a writer I really admire, namely Nancy Cartwright, in a wonderful book called Why Do the Laws of Nature Lie? Which is a bit more complicated than that argument. But nonetheless, there is a kind of assumption that ultimately the postulation of these things, the cash value are the regularities themselves. So think of that as the standard the standard empiricist, instrumentalist critique of scientific realism. Flip side now, in contrast to this, the empiricist is going to argue that since the content of these theories just is the appearances themselves, then scientific theories and laws are really simply best understood as forms of inductive summations of those appearances. That is, accounts of, so causal laws are really about regularities in the appearances. And we have these laws because they enable us to make predictions and the like. So, to know that B regularly follows A, so falling asleep regularly follows taking opium, or whatever you do with opium. Well, what's that called? Taking it. Shows my naivete. Okay. I'm just guessing. So, to know that B, falling asleep regularly follows A, taking the opium, is to know why B occurred. Namely, because A. That is, I fell asleep because I took opium. Now, if you have an iota of curiosity as a human being, this is terribly unsatisfying, since this merely re-describes what happened without really providing an answer to why. Which is why scientists really are interested in mechanisms. Nonetheless, so if you really want to know why, then you're going to start using power and force and mechanism talk all over again. So we can see that, and this is the structure of an ongoing debate between empiricists and rationalists. That is, one of them suggesting that we need to posit a second tier, and the other arguing that the second tier is nothing but a rather metaphysical way of stating what is already there in the appearances. Now, of course, here in Hegel, we're not actually debating the status of scientific theories. Hegel's arguments, nonetheless, exactly mimic this debate. But what Hegel's concerned with is the philosophical and metaphysical corollary, which presumes that these theories just are our connectedness to the world. That is, they represent how we have a world at all, by having a model of the world that represents the world like that. And remember last week I said we are committed to this because it's already implied by perception itself. We have to go into the two-tier scientific view. Now, in the dialectic of this chapter, when faced with the emptiness of inductive empiricism, we are offered increasingly complicated accounts of the underlying forces. Forces, so now going on to Hegel's next stage, soliciting and being solicited by one another. And what I want to say here, and this is the point, that apart from details, the arguments here are going to be, every single one of them. Why is that door? There seems to be a party going on out there. That the arguments here are going to be just a repetition of what we already see. Namely, that the upshot of all these forces is simply going to be the appearances. Again, so paragraph 141, what they are, what these forces are, they are only in this middle term, in this contact, the contact that happens at the level of appearances. And in the same paragraph 141, towards the end, Hegel begins hinting at where he is going. Thus, the truth of force, he says, remains only in the thought. Of course, the only is going to become the truth. That is, the thought of it is going to be the real thing and not merely an hypothesis. Now, all of this presses understanding into more desperate attempts to generate a non-sensible but non-ideal condition that can plausibly ground the appearances, collect them up, unify them, without skeptical remainder. So that's the project. Every step in this chapter is searching for a non-sensible but non-ideal, non-mentalistic condition of possibility to unify the appearances, and that can be plausibly what is underlying them. However, the important extra gesture that happens at this juncture is that the understanding now recognizes that the non-sensible condition must be really, Hegel's word is, supersensuous. So in saying that it's simply not non-sensible, not immediately there, but it must be supersensuous, that is, it must be the kind of non-sensible condition that is, I want to say, thought-like. Almost an ideal. So a supersensible world that is actually metaphysically there. Which is why, I can see you're puzzled as hell. For heaven's sakes, think Plato, first of all, and then think Galileo, second of all. That will do it. And then think Newton, third of all. Okay, you get the picture. So, which is why Hegel now shifts his account to a discussion from forces to a discussion of law. But law not conceived of as things we make, but law as already the structure of the universe. So law read Platonistically. Law as the metaphysical truth lying behind or regulating the appearances. So, if you go to MIT and you go into the bathroom, MIT has weird graffiti on the walls, and, the one I saw was, God said, and then, an endless equation covering the whole stall, and then he said that, and there was light. Right? But that's the thought here. That's the structure of the world. Einstein thought this in his letters to Born. He says, God, thought in mathematics. Mathematics is the true underlying structure of the world. Law is that. So law is not something we posit. It is a metaphysical reality. Is the thought. Okay? So law is the quiet, unchanging structure. Law does not change, but law is the law of everything that does change. So law is the unity, the unchanging, underlying something of everything that does change. Now, notice again that consciousness is now taking the non-sensible ground, again, to be kind of like itself, kind of thought-like. And again, Hegel's first go at this new thinking of the non-sensible ground, namely that we just postulate it, there must be this non-sensible ground, and we assume that we can have... How on earth did Plato see the ideas, right? He had some sort of weird intellectual intuition, right? And Hegel imagines here that someone imagines they can have this weird kind of intellectual intuition and simply see these ideas as the truth of the universe. So they can see or directly perceive this supersensible beyond. So at the very beginning of paragraph 146, again, I always feel I ought to, every once in a while, touch the text so you know I'm not making it up. The inner world, that's what this is, the inner world, is for consciousness still a pure beyond, because consciousness does not yet find itself in it. That's the kind of self-repudiation at work here. It is empty, for it is merely the nothingness of appearance and positively the simple or unitary universal. The mode of the inner being of things finds ready acceptance by those who say that the inner of things is unknowable. Now, at the beginning of paragraph 147, just to show you the dialectic, he says, the inner world, or supersensible beyond, what we've just been discussing, has, however, come into being. It comes from the world of appearances, which has mediated it. In other words, the appearances is its essence, in fact, its filling. So, paragraph 146 is the rationalist two-tiered model. Paragraph 147, the instrumentalist reductive critique, that the real content of the inner is simply the outer and what appears. So just the same structure all over again. Hence, we are brought back to the appearances, determining or giving determinacy to what is supposed to be their ground. And so the dialectic here remains the same. For the sake of explanatory content, we posit some extra empirical item to provide the world with a true metaphysical two-tiered structure, whose second tier is found to require appearances in order to explain its determinacy. So the explainer is explained by what it explains. Hence, the explainer is turned into the explained. Hence, the relation between the two is an inversion. That, in fact, as we're going to see in a moment, everything we've been seeing is about a series of inversions. The sensuous becoming the supersensuous becoming the truth of the supersensuous, becoming the sensuous. So the whole chapter is this series of inversions. Okay, let me say something about law. I want to say something about law. No, let me stop there, because we're about to get on to the inverted world. We knew it was coming. But I thought, before we talk about the inverted world, a cup of coffee is necessary. So let's take a deep breath, have our usual break. We'll talk about law and then the inverted world. And if you've now got questions, come back full of them. Hegel now runs exactly the same argument all over again with respect to law. So, on the one hand, this sounds like good liberalism, right? On the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, the very idea of appearances obeying laws, if such laws are not going to be mere repetitions of those appearances, requires what I call conceptual assent. That is, that we get insight into the meaning of diverse phenomena by seeing how things that look different turn out, if we go up another level, to be obeying the same law. That there's a law at the level of appearances, and then there's an overarching law. And of course, the example that he uses here, the example that blew everybody's mind, which I regard as the beginning of modernity, is Newton's unification of the laws of terrestrial mechanics and the laws of celestial mechanics under one single set of laws of motion and gravity, inverse square law. And Hegel therefore imagines, and that just looks right. You can understand why that would be a form of insight. And Hegel then goes on to argue that we must imagine this conceptual assent happening to the point at which there is only one law, or if not only one law, even just the idea of lawfulness itself. And at this moment, he says, we might get queasy and be puzzled about how there can be just one law that is the truth of everything. That is, it seems as if we've again lost the very determinacy, right? Just to state, the inverse square law doesn't seem like you're going to get an account of everything. Now, said like this has got to be the worst argument in the entire chapter. It really is a bad argument. And it's a bad argument because there really is something deep about conceptual assent. It is a form of insight. And therefore, he seems not here to be taking account of what's going on in systemization and building up deductive systems and the like. So what is he thinking about here? What's underlying what looks like just a bad argument? Well, I take it that what Hegel is driving at is that when we get to the highest level of unity, when we get to the idea of lawfulness itself, first, we seem to be utterly cut off from the empirical world. But we're cut off from the empirical world in a particular way. Namely, and I take it this is what he's hinting at, that the very idea of lawfulness is not something we can read into the phenomena, but rather it's something that we must itself stipulate as a form of understanding. That is what he's assuming. Just to do something with your blank books, is that the person who thought hardest about this was obviously Kant. And Kant tried to demonstrate in the second analogy that the principle of cause and effect is not a given, not a structure of the universe, but a form of understanding. So what Hegel's doing here is suggesting that when we look at the notion of one law, we actually have a certain moment of opacity, in the sense that we have a kind of necessity which we don't understand. And we don't understand it because we're treating it as given. Right? So we're treating the notion of law as a given, and therefore it suddenly is emptied of content. While again, conversely, when we look at the many laws, we just get again a mere repetition of appearances. So what he's thinking here is that the debate, I think this is the thought that he's thinking, that the debate between realism and empiricism over law is actually a debate which asks the question, is truth analytic or synthetic? And of course, you might say that the naive idea of science, those of you who read the first chapter of Dialectic Enlightenment, the naive idea of science is to make the whole world nothing but an analytic judgment, as if everything should follow from one transparent idea. And of course, it was Leibniz's actual project. Right? Let us remember that Leibniz actually did think the universe was nothing but an analytic judgment. Scary. And then conversely, that everything is synthetic. And that we've got now content that simply repeats the world and structure that simply is empty. And we don't know how to put these two sides together. So the one law, many law, as I hear Hegel struggling with it, is not working because at the extreme, both sides are unusable. I think that's what he's supposing. Now, it is this situation that brings us to the question of the inverted world. And I wrote here in my notes, ugh. Okay. Now, remember my orienting question. Namely, what kind of difficulty or failure in consciousness is going to force consciousness to change its fundamental stance towards the world. That is, to change the direction of the arrow. So what we're talking about is not just changing a particular thought, because I try to argue that the difference between knowledge and action is one of fundamental stance. And we're asking what kind of failure is going to force consciousness to alter its stance, which is to say to give up, and let's be clear what we're asking, to give up the idea that the differences the constitutive differences we find in reality are determined by reality. That reality gives us not just divides itself up into cups and saucers, but into substances, causal events, and the like, things with causes, all that. It has to give up that idea, and it has to adopt the idea that the kinds of differences in reality that matter, and hence the kinds of unities and differences that matter, must come from consciousness. That is, we're going to try to force consciousness to itself make the Copernican turn. And thus far, all we have seen are higher level failures of the kind that beset perception, with two provisos. First, there is now the demand that identity and difference be somehow internally related to one another. The in itself of force is its for another. And secondly, we have begun to suppose that the identity as the ground of difference derives from an object that is thought-like, kind of ideal. It's kind of interesting when you think about Plato. Why Plato chose ideas to be the metaphysical reality? And the answer is because they're like thoughts. They're like the very things we think with. Right? So he's thinking that what's deep about the structure of reality is the idea of reality, but he just postulated it up there. Okay, now Hegel's first mention of the idea of an inverted world is announced as the consequence of the positing of a second supersensible world. Paragraph 157. This second supersensible world is in this way the inverted world, and moreover, since one aspect is already present in the first supersensible world, the inversion of the first. With this, the inner world is completed as appearance. For the first supersensible world was only the immediate raising of the perceived world into the universal element. That's the move we've been looking at all along. It had its necessary counterpart in this perceived world, which still retained for itself the principle of change and alteration. That's the empiricist comeback. The first kingdom of laws lacked that principle. That is, the inner world lacked the idea of change in itself, but obtains it as an inverted world. Clear as mud. Now, in fact, if I just read that coherently, this is a version of the same dialectic we've been using throughout. That is, throughout we have been seeing that the truth of the appearance is really what does not appear, hence inverted, and conversely, the actuality of the supersensible or force or law is inverted, that is, the appearances. Hence, the truth of the sensuous is the supersensuous, and the truth of the supersensuous is the sensuous, and each is an inversion of the other. Pippin nicely states this on page 137, where he says, to the extent that such realities and such legislation are empirically independent, they simply invert the sensible world into something else and do not explain it. The classic case, he says, is Aristotle's critique of Plato. Right? Aristotle simply asks, what do you gain by saying the universal is up there rather than in the thing itself? Right? There's no explanatory force there. To the extent that they are not independent, to the extent that the empirical manifold is the sole criterion of knowledge, the sensible world inverts itself, is unintelligible without the supersensible world, already caught on the first horn of the dilemma. Now, if this is right, and I just want to step back for a second before I go forward. If this is right, then the idea of inversion or perversion, either will do here, is not a new moment, but rather it is making explicit the fundamental gesture that consciousness has been rehearsing at every single step along the way. All along, consciousness had suffered inversion, beginning with sense certainty. So we discovered the truth of sense certainty, it's this here now, was the universal, the very opposite, the inverse of what it claimed. And hence, it said the opposite of what it intended. The truth was inverted on it. Or, the structure of failure operated in inversion, namely, inverting the thing from the many to the one. So the one, right? The many requires the one, the many presupposes the one, and the one presupposes the many. So each turns out to be an inversion of the other. That's the structure of perception. And here, we've been looking at a shuffling back and forth between an empty supersensible unity and an indeterminate sensible many. Now, if this is right, if I'm right that the notion of inversion is actually the structure of consciousness's movement at every stage, then the whole structure of consciousness is nothing but a series of inversions. And if it's true that the entire movement of consciousness is nothing but a series of inversions, then consciousness can only progress if it inverts its inversions. That is, it must make a turn out of its inversions and do what's going to count as, or ask itself the question, what will count as inverting the method of inversions? roughly the thought here, is that consciousness must come to recognize that all the different ways that have arisen for accounting for reality, namely accounting for it as the this, as the one and the many, as forces, as laws, all these different ways of seeing reality have come from it. And hence, that what has looked to be like changes in the world have not been changes in the world, but changes in our comprehension or the way in which we take the world. Okay, saying it like that is too quick and doesn't quite work, but it's only a little false. So now let's see if I can make the thought even a little bit deeper. Let us look at the text. God help us. First, the opening of paragraph 156. Thus the change is not yet a change of the thing itself, but rather presents itself as pure change by the very fact that the content of the moments of change remain the same. But since the notion qua notion of the understanding is the same as the inner being of things, this change becomes for the understanding the law of the inner world. The understanding thus learns. First time we've seen the word learn something here. So something is happening here, even though this looks very dark and mysterious. Hegel thinks he's saying something here, that something's happening to the understanding. The understanding thus learns. What does it learn? It learns that it is a law of appearance itself, that differences arise which are no differences, or that what is self-same repels itself from itself, and similarly that the differences are only such as are in reality no differences and which cancel themselves. In other words, what is not self-same is self-attractive. Mud again. Now something is going on here that is an insight, there is a learning, and there is a mistake here. And hence that's what structures Hegel's argument, that this is a moment of insight error, insight blindness. So what is it? Well, there is a positing here of a second law and a second supersensible world, since understanding now gives the law of the inner world. So that a second law now arises in which what was formally characteristic of the law of appearances and said to lay outside the inner world finds itself in the region of the inner world. That is, consciousness has come to the thought that it kept wanting to put stability here, change here, unity here, many here. And therefore it kept the two worlds separate. And that, because of that separateness, it had what we saw as the problem of shuffling. So now it's saying that we must, as it were, put both elements in the same inner world. So what understanding now understands, what it's learned, is that the one and the many, appearance and reality, changing and unchanging, identity and difference, must all belong to one domain. That the problem was the separation of domains. So he talks about the problem as a different sustaining element. So we can only get by this problem by making sure it's all in one domain. No longer a two-world, a two-tier view. But somehow we must be talking about the structure of one domain, and this domain is now identified as the inner of things. So both elements, again, the one and the many, change and unchanged, all belong to one domain, and it's the way it's articulated. Now the confusion that arises here arises because when this second supersensible world appears, it appears as just another inversion, as just another movement in the shuffling we've been looking at, and not, I'm suggesting, an inversion of inversion. So I have to separate. So just another inversion versus an inversion of inversion. That's what I have to distinguish. But the point here is, because it appears as just another inversion, it appears absurdly. And it appears absurdly, to say it appears absurdly is to say that it appears in all the crazy ways that the paragraphs following paragraph 157 talk about. Roughly. And this is how I understand what Hegel is doing here. Understanding, having grasped the idea that identity and difference belong to one integral reality, that's the insight, presumes that if that's the case, then anything must be capable of turning into its opposite, since that's what the structure has been, things turning into their opposite. So if what's held them apart is thinking they're in two domains, but if we now put them all in one domain, then we can say anything can turn into opposite. So north can become south, sweet can become sour, and we get all these crazy stories that Hegel tells. What on earth are you talking about? Here's my guess. I think he's saying that at this point, the understanding has gone too far, and that it has appropriated the idea of identity and difference solely to itself, and left the actuality or the world wholly outside. Now, the consequence of this is that it makes every difference a mere difference. Or as we now say, if you want to be postmodern, a diacritical difference. So this idea of the inverted world is actually a bad Saussurean difference. That is, this is really about the arbitrariness of the sign. And it's saying that if you assume that identity and difference all come from a single domain in which has no content, then anything can count as the opposite of anything else. Or, remember, the laughter act, the two bathrooms with different pictures, and it doesn't matter just as long as they're different. So they've lost any content. So the fact of difference or opposition comes to dominate the content, and hence becomes groundless, hence becomes arbitrary. Hegel's thought, and I don't know how else to read this idea. I just don't know any other way of doing it. But saying that difference becomes mere difference. And if it becomes mere difference, then anything can be. We're granting that there's a necessity for marking differences. That's an insight, right? But if we say it's arbitrary, then anything can turn into the opposite of itself, since it's given its position just by being marked as the opposite. So if it's the opposite, then the opposite can be the opposite of it. So north can become south, sweet becomes south. And that's plainly crazy, which is equally what's plainly crazy about the arbitrariness of the sign. It makes no sense. Now, Hegel's thought, you didn't think it was going to go here, did you? You didn't see this one coming. I didn't see it coming. But I don't know how else to read this possibility of inversion as the notion of difference being affirmed but without content. That's clearly the thought here. So Hegel's thought here must be that the movement from one to many, from identity to difference, must be a true self-movement of the world, not a positing, that's the dangerous Fichtean word, of unity behind difference, or arbitrarily marking differences, but a comprehending of the movement of reality as self-differing, where the comprehension of reality as self-differing is not different from reality as a whole. The comprehension of reality as self-differing is actually just the structure of reality itself. But you can't separate the reality from its comprehension. So, in paragraph 158, Hegel illustrates this idea. Now we'll have to see if this works out in content, by talking about crime, law, and punishment. In which each could say the opposite. So let's look at the passage, paragraph 158. In another sphere, in the middle of the paragraph. Now, when I wrote this at 3, now it's 4:30 in the morning, so it's been tougher for me to unwind this. In another sphere, revenge on an enemy is, according to the immediate law, the supreme satisfaction of the injured individuality. So, immediately, at the level of appearances, revenge is the spontaneous response to injury. And Hegel just always assumes, by the way, that this is the case. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Someone kills, you kill back. This law, this very law, however, which bids me to confront him as himself a person who does not treat me as such, who has injured me, and in fact bids me destroy him as an individuality, this law is turned around by the principle of the other world into its opposite. The reinstatement of myself as a person through the self-destruction of the alien individuality, is turned into self-destruction. So the problem with revenge is, what I mean by revenging myself and killing the other is to have rectified the past. But all that happens is, of course, that I've set myself up to be killed in return. So the only way I can act on the law of revenge, which is the given law of appearance, is to be destroyed. Call that the empiricism of injury. That's Hegel's assumption here. Step 2. Now we're going to get a kind of realism of injury. If now this inversion, which finds expression in the punishment of crime, is made into law, now we're moving behind, right? So now we're moving to realism. And we're taking that, the idea that if there's a killing, there must be a law which says he who kills, she who kills is punished. It too is the law of one world which is confronted by an inverted supersensible world where what is despised in the former is honored, and what is in the former is honored meets with contempt. The punishment which under the law of the first world disgraces and destroys a man is transformed in its inverted world into pardon, which preserves his essential being and brings him his honor. What is Hegel talking about here? And he was. By the way, he thought you should have laughed. So take it that he was making a joke. Okay. My wife often says I often laugh alone. What's the joke here? Who is he making fun of? Where is the criminal who trespasses honored? Someone whispered it. Christianity. Thank you. So Christianity is just the inversion of the other structure. So if you've killed and you're a sinner, then you're going to be the first one to get into heaven. You know, we love the sinner's best. Right? That's why, you know, George Bush loves, what's his name, who chases little boys around. That's what he said. He's a sinner, and everyone's a sinner, right? So the point here is that he doesn't take Christianity seriously because it simply is an inversion. But if it's just an inversion, then equally you can just do the same in another way, right? What looks like honor in one world is awful in another world. What's awful here is honored in, you know. So, you know, he who is last shall be first. I mean. Okay. Well, what's going to stop that movement? Paragraph 159. And it's 2/3 the way down page 98. The actual crime, however, has its intention and is in itself as possibility in the intention as such, but not in a good intention, for the truth of intention is only in the act itself. By the way, that's a Hegelian principle. That's an anti-Kantian Hegelian principle. The truth of intention is the act itself. We don't give a damn for Hegelians about intentions. We're going to spend a lot of time on that. Don't worry about it now. But Hegel takes that as the absolutely essential. Intentions are like, you know, a furry Platonic background action. Hegel's interested in action. For the truth of intention is only in the act itself, but the crime, as regards its content, has its reflection into self or its inversion in the actual punishment, that is, notice the word here, the word he chooses. That is the reconciliation. Reconciliation? Where have we been? No one talked to us about reconciliation before. But suddenly we're reconciling something with something else. We're bringing two things together that have been held apart and finding in them an internal relationship. And this whole book is going to be about reconciliation. It's going to be the structure. Instead of truth, we're going to get reconciliation. Whatever that means. No idea. That is the reconciliation of the law with the actuality opposed to it in the cry. Punishment is the reconciliation of the law with the cry. Finally, the actual punishment has its inverted actuality present in it in such a way that the punishment is an actualization of the law. Notice actualization, potential actualizing itself, whereby the activity exercised by the law as punishment suspends itself, and from being active, the law becomes again quiescent and is vindicated. And the conflict of individual with it, and of it with individuality, is extinguished. Okay. Pretty okay. But this is actually pointing towards Hegel's own odd theory of punishment. And Hegel's odd theory of punishment has the following character, and it's this. Hegel says you cannot actually believe that a law is a law if you do not equally agree to punish the transgression of the law. And the reason for that is because what makes us think that a law counts as a law if people break it and we do nothing? Right? So, if there's a law and everyone breaks it all the time, then is it a law? So the actuality of the law itself only reveals itself as actual in the act that transgresses it, and our further punishment of that crime. So notice now the law itself is now differing from itself. The law is not up here and the other stuff down here. The law is articulating its own internal meaning, right, by saying that a transgression of the law will bring about a punishment, and the punishment will, and now Hegel says something really shocking, especially for someone who's worked in prisons, that punishment is something that the criminal deserves or merits as a person. And you may say, that sounds absurd. But it's actually what we do think. And the reason I know we think it is because if we think someone is not free or not a person, we don't punish them. If we think they're mad or underage or all the extenuating circumstances, so punishment is something that only persons truly merit, deserve as persons, and hence what looks like the opposite law is actually a way of reconciling, bringing that individual back into accord with the law, and therefore reinstating the law as the structure of that relationship. Now, that's a theory. I know it's a theory of law and punishment that not everyone likes, but we're interested in the metaphysics of that theory. And the metaphysics of that theory is that this entire movement, everything that happens, is both the law differing from itself. What could be more opposite than law than transgression? What could be more awful than punishment? But each of these things turn out to be moments of the law articulating itself and reinstating it, he says, its quiet, its stability. So this is the idea of an identity differing from itself. The law says don't kill. Killing happens. But in the movement, right, the identity of the law is attained. So the identity of the law only occurs through the very things that are different from it and oppose it. And therefore make the law the law. The whole cycle. Now this is where Hegel is going. So before I turn to paragraph 160, we stop there. That's our concrete illustration. And we got a model of the difference between two worlds and one world. That's what we're trying to get. We're trying to see that the idea of one and many, identity and difference, does not require a two-tiered structure, but an idea of a self-moving actuality sustaining itself through its various moments, by which it becomes the in itself it already was. So, paragraph 160 then. Yeah?
Somebody. I mean, obviously, it seems to be echoing a lot of what we talked about in terms of causality of state. I mean, is this any attempt to continue what you talked about?
It's a little different. We haven't got quite a causality of fate structure yet. This is actually a very formal theory of punishment, which says that there is something right about retributive theories of punishment. People maybe Kant and Hegel, those old German softies, slow and behold believe in retributive theories of punishment. But they try, at least the line that Hegel adopts is, and I think the line I just gave you is a fair summation of the philosophy of right, more or less. Looking at Rossio, which she knows that text better than I do. Hoping somebody does. So yeah, we haven't got yet that kind of structure. So there's here no forgiveness, none of that kind of stuff yet. We won't get to that till later. Yeah.
It's basically this conception of law and transgression of law to reinstate the law. In the early theological writings, we have the part where he stated that laws are composed of opposing realities. Is that basically how far the law and transgression and the opposing realities?
Yeah, he's using a slightly more naive conception here. He's not now, because there he's actually worried about law as the opposite of reality. Here he's looking at the whole structure of law, transgression, punishment, as the way in which, after all, it's the way in which the criminal gets brought back into the community as one of us. Again, we do think that. The criminal has done his time. That is, the slate's clean. The law is where it is, and the individual is no longer a transgressor, but is now, again, one of us. So all this hurly-burly, and everything starts back to where it was. That's what he's interested in here. So what I'm suggesting for the moment is forget about the spirit of Christianity and its faith. It will just confuse you in this passage. I see why you're thinking it, and I have in my margins here spirit of Christianity, and now I've covered the whole. I was wrong. I made the same temptation, but I think what I'm doing now is what he's actually thinking about. Yeah.
Well, since natural laws can't be transgressed, is that a problem?
He's not taking them as natural laws, he's taking them as positive.
For scientific.
No, well, I mean, he's going to take natural laws as not natural. That's why this case is easier. That's why it's interesting when you discuss this. It's hard to see how the grip is going to get there in those other cases. So I'm using this as the model of self-differing reality. And I'll explain how we get back to the question of nature later. Yeah. Oh, why say that? That's interesting. Why say that?
Just this idea of the sort of this necessary other that has to sort of reestablish boundaries of the law. I mean, am I wrong in sort of seeing not a similar?
No. I think one of the things that Hegel thinks, that Freud thinks, that there is no law without the transgression of law. Yes, indeed. So there has to be a moment of abjection as a condition of identity. But it's also to say here, much more naively, no identity except from what opposes that identity as a condition of that identity itself. So yeah, there is something of that. There's something of, this is Beardsworth's reading of Christaven, right? She has that Hegelian way of reading the abject exactly. Yeah. That's nice. You two are looking, asking, you have a joint question, or? Okay, 160. From the idea, then, of inversion, which constitutes the essential nature of one aspect of a supersensible world, we must eliminate the sensuous idea of fixing the differences in a different sustaining element. There's no structural divide between the one and the many. There's no divided line. There's no noumena phenomena difference. All those ways of trying to fix the difference, right, actually is the cause of the series of inversion. So we have to get rid of the idea of what he calls the different sustaining element. And once we do that, he says, then this absolute notion of the difference must be represented and understood purely as inner difference. That is, something can only be different from itself, or is, to use Hegel's language, self-othering, or again, Hegel's language, a repulsion of the self-same as self-same from itself, and likeness of the unlike as unlike. But all of this now can be understood as this model of the law achieving its status as law by what differs, breaks from it, transgresses it, and then must be reconciled back with it in order for it to be itself. Right? So it needs its opposite not as another world, but as its own internal corollary. So no identity without difference, and the difference is always the difference of an identity constituted by that difference. Skip down 3 or 4 sentences, but just because. But just because I have the opposites here, in and for itself, it is the opposite of itself, or it has the other immediately present in it. So the other is not absolutely other. If it was absolutely other, they were back in the world of inversion. There can't be absolute otherness. And we're going to argue about this all semester long. Let's wait and argue about it in say, the master-slave. But Hegel denies the strong version of absolute otherness. He says it just generates the logic of inversion. And I know, for all sorts of reasons, that's a contestable idea. But in this case, the other is object. The identity is the self. So we're talking about subject-object dualism. We're trying to overcome subject-object dualism. That's what's at stake here. So he says, thus the supersensible world, which is the inverted world, has at the same time overarched the other world and has it within it. It is for itself the inverted world, i.e. the inversion of itself. This is the inversion of the inversion, I promised. It is itself and its opposite in one unity. Only thus is it difference as inner difference, or difference in its own self, or difference as an infinity. What these awkward locutions are pressing is the thought that, first, consciousness is not going to find anything outside itself to articulate or ground the relation of identity and difference. And hence, second, that the structure of identity and difference is going to be a self-differing of consciousness itself, or what is the same, consciousness's act of self-determining will become the source or ground for distinguishing and holding together the perceptual manifold. The idea of infinity is for Hegel the same as the idea of necessary self-determination, freedom, because he is contending that nothing outside consciousness can determine the categorical forms of experience. Nothing outside consciousness can determine the categorical forms of experience. Hence, possible knowledge claims cannot be measured against the standard of, now take a list, say, now whatever you want to be the outside. So the non-inferentially warranted given, the apprehension of universals, sense properties, the intellection of a nonsensible ground, or reliance on law. Those all might be things you want to measure your knowledge against. But you can't. Right? You can't. Right? That's what we've seen to be impossible. So the possibility of consciousness's autonomous self-determination can now only be measured against itself. Consciousness has become self-conscious. Or that's the Copernican turn. That's it. You've made it. You've done it all by yourself. Right? That's what you have accepted in accepting this move. Now, this seems weaker and disappointing compared to Kant. And I want to puzzle that thought out for the next 15 minutes. Why this movement of Hegel seems, having struggled so hard to get here, seems so flat. And it does seem flat. And I want to suggest its flatness is going to be the source of future depth. How am I going to do that? Let's go back to page A109. Let's go back to Kant and see what he does at this moment in the argument. And then we'll see what Hegel does. And we'll see if we can then see why we're going one way rather than another. This is that hand that you already have. Oh, you've already, there you go. So, just picking up where I left off last time. Remember, the transcendental object equals X. All these Lockean ideas, which we've now seen to be force and law and all these other notions. So Kant says the pure concept of the transcendental object X, the transcendental object, which in reality, throughout all our knowledge, is always one and the same. So the function of the transcendental object equals X is what remains the same throughout all reality, and it is what can alone confer upon all our empirical concepts in general relation to an object that is objective reality. This concept cannot contain any determinate intuition. It's not another perceptual given, because it's what anchors things, shows that they're parts of reality, and therefore refers only, and now he absolutely does the Copernican turn right before our eyes, therefore refers only to the unity which must be met with in any manifold of knowledge which stands in relation to an object. So it refers only to the unity. Well, what unity? The relation, so far it could be Locke. Right? It could be substance I know not what, it could be law, it could be the good in Plato, it could be any of those things, but what does he say it is? The relation is nothing but the necessary unity of consciousness. And therefore also the synthesis of the manifold through the common function of the mind, which combines it in one representation. So what looked like to be, so this is, my interpretation of Kant actually says that the transcendental picture is a transcendental reinterpretation of Locke's new way of ideas. That's, I think, exactly what's going on here. He's reinterpreting Locke, saying, no, it's not substance that grounds reality, it's consciousness that grounds the unity of the object. Now this claim, consciousness does it, transcendental unity of apperception, brings us back to paragraph 163, which is where we ended last week, and where it looks like we're going to end this week. So it's nice to know that in 2.5 hours of lecturing I've gone nowhere. Let's see if we make a little progress. I take it, I'm not going to reread the paragraph, I take it that Hegel is here as he has been all along. In the previous paragraph with a great deal of huffing and puffing about the self-identical being self-sundering, trying to explain what this new idea of infinity amounts to. And if you remember last week, we read the overblown and somewhat embarrassing passage about explanation providing so much self-satisfaction, because in it consciousness is enjoying only itself. Now, the reason Hegel takes us here is not only the idea that understanding the world through forms, here explanation, that are as anthropocentric as could be. It's not just that. It is the introduction of the notion of satisfaction that is meant to be pressing the argument forward. The truth, right, of consciousness is it can't get no satisfaction, right? So the whole thing is just a rock song. If there is satisfaction, and here's what consciousness lacks, if there is satisfaction, then there is a desire that is being satisfied. Why is that important? I think it's at just this point that Hegel is going beyond Kant. Kant immediately assumes that the discovery of the forms for integrating the perceptual manifold are simply going to be necessary conditions for the possibility of self-consciousness. And this presupposes all of Kant's kind of theory about forms of intuition and inner time consciousness and the like. Now, Hegel assumes that assessing the terms through which we evaluate what concepts or categories we need in order to comprehend the world must answer to what we want from those forms or categories. So, while Hegel agrees with Kant that the link between the non-sensible and the sensible, between pure concepts and the sensory manifold, is supplied by consciousness itself, his claim is we cannot make sense of that activity of consciousness directly, as if it were an immediate question. Well, what would the question be? Kant's question seems to be, how are representations of the world possible? But if that's Kant's question, then that's a very bad question that we opened up in the introduction that said it was the fear of truth. So that's the very question that denies knowing. Hence, in order to circumvent Kant, Hegel presses the Copernican term, that is the announcement of infinity, but does so in a manner that presses consciousness outside the idea of a bare representational knowing of the world. That is, Kantianism is still a representational account of knowing, even though, of course, it requires activity. And the way Hegel gets beyond the representational account of knowing is to press the thought that the self-determining activity of knowing is really, I don't know how to do this except by speaking loudly. Activity! I mean, it's really action. It's action in the real sense and not in some ersatz sense. It's not action in the form of knowing, it's really a form of action. So the thought here is that knowing must itself be framed as a component of the life of beings who are essentially agents. Now, you're going to say to me, wait a minute, this is not news. Kant and Fichte say as much, don't they? Isn't that what's implied by the Copernican term? Isn't that what's implied by the idea of spontaneity and synthesis and the like? Hegel wants to argue that what kept or keeps Kant and Fichte pigeonholed is they do not actually believe what they say, since they argue as if we are still grounded in the world by our representations of the world. That is, they're still taking it that the fundamental relationship between subject and object is a representational knowing. That is, they express or press the case of agency, and they do. Both of them talk about knowing as a form of agency. And then they withdraw that view at the same time by making the representational relationship to the world the ground of our relationship to the world. So they say we're agents, and yet they say it's just representations. Hence, they suppress, and this is my thesis, they suppress the very activity that they introduce by suppressing it as the activity of a being who is essentially an embodied agent in the world. If we can only know what we have made, which is what all this is about, some version of the maker's knowledge thesis, then what we need here is a more serious understanding of human beings as makers or determiners of the world. Hence, the transition to a new form of consciousness has not one, but I think two aspects. The infinity of thought is that consciousness can only discover the grounds of the structure of identity and difference by examining itself. Consciousness must become self-consciousness. That move now seems easy. But second, that self-consciousness must be truly active, truly world-forming or determining, hence truly the work of an agent, that is, a being whose needs and desires lead it to act so as to determine the world. So the problem with Kant's synthetic forms of synthesis is they're acts without desire. If they're acts without desire, then they lack the fundamental structure of agency. So there's something about them that is both an act and not an act. And Kant's way of saying that they're an act and not an act is bundled all up into the world. Spontaneity. It happens. We do it. But in what sense do we do it intentionally? So what Hegel wants to say is this business of satisfaction. Knowledge must be fundamentally satisfying to agents. And therefore, it must be a true structure of agency at work in determining which categorical sets, what frames, what ideas we use for the sake of knowledge getting, if knowledge getting is an activity we do. Hence, the assumption in all this is simply that there can be no action without there being a spring of action. And the spring of an action must be at least minimally, starting at the most simplest level, a need or desire. Hence, to move to self-consciousness, which which is where we're heading, is equally to move to a different relationship to the world, namely one in which the agent originally is related to this other by desiring it. So my simple thought is here is actually the problem in Kant is it's action without desire. And it's desire we need to get beyond the bad form of transcendental idealism and move to a conception of knowing that treats knowers as true agents. That's why Hegel talks about satisfaction. And hence that funny passage about satisfaction is indeed that very phrase, the critique of Kant's version of the confirmative term in Hegel's account. Okay, that's what I wrote at 5 o'clock this morning. Questions? I guess we have a couple of minutes. Have I actually worn you out completely? Yep, worn you out completely. Okay, next week we really do go to subconsciousness. Because if you don't get it now, I can't do any better. This is the best I can do with this stuff. And we'll do what we can next week.